Okay, hello and welcome to the Digital Scholar webinar series hosted by the Southern California CTSI, USC, and also Children's Hospital Los Angeles. My name is Eric Peterson. I am the co-director of digital recruitment for the CTSI, SCC CTSI, and also an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. Please follow us on Twitter if you're interested. Here's my personal as well as the one for the CTSI. We make a lot of announcements on there. So if you haven't attended one of our webinars before, just real quick, wanted to check in and let you know about the Q&A function that's there. There's also a chat function. Please add questions to the chat as they come up for you. You'll see it at the bottom of the webinar panel there. The speaker today will field questions at the end of the talk, but please feel free to type them in as they come up throughout the talk, and I will lead a discussion. And so we're excited today to host Dr. Pamela Tenaerts. She's going to present the work of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and discuss two main topics regarding digital clinical trials. And we are really excited to have her here because both of these are highly relevant right now. Many researchers have either been completely delaying clinical trials during the pandemic, or they're attempting to move some or all of their aspects of these trials online. So she's going to talk about both moving trials remote and also planning for decentralized trials from the beginning. So Dr. Tenaerts is the executive director of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which she will tell you a little bit more about. But very briefly, it's a public-private partnership aimed to develop and drive adoption of practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. She has practiced medicine in both the emergency department and in a private practice setting before embarking on a career in research. And Dr. Tenaerts received her MD from Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, and an MBA from the University of South Florida. Lots of other really great things about her too. You can see them here, but we are ready to introduce Dr. Pamela Tenaerts. Stop sharing.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Okay.
All right. I just want to make sure that you can hear me too.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me here today. I'm really honored to be here and speak to all of you. And it's about a topic that, as Eric mentioned, a lot of you are thinking about, and a lot of us are thinking about too. It's become critically important in how to keep clinical trials going with a pandemic in action, I guess. Trying to see how to. Okay, so I think you saw this already, so we'll skip over this. A little bit about City, as Eric mentioned, we're a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership co-founded by Duke University and the Food and Drug Administration. And we are completely multi-stakeholder in that we've been lucky enough to have the participation of over 500 organizations, of which about 80 have been members. And we have a mission to drive and develop adoption of practices that will increase quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And we do that with an evidence-based system. We use a social science team to sort of get from personal opinion to trends and really use that as a basis for recommendations. We've also been lucky enough to have had impact in being, our recommendations being adopted by many organizations that conduct clinical trials and also being incorporated in some regulatory guidance documents, both here at the FDA, EMA, and ICH. I mentioned that we're multi-stakeholders, but it actually goes a little further than that. Everyone, when we do projects as City, everyone has an equal seat at the table. So we work with everyone in the clinical trial enterprise, and you can see here who that is. It's investigators and sites, government and regulators, industry, which increasingly is also health data and technology companies, not just the pharma, bio, device, and CROs of 20 years ago anymore. IRBs, academia, and patient and caregivers. And I think it is critical that everybody has an equal voice at the table, because it's really about incentives and disincentives and understanding those to be able to come up with recommendations that can then move the field forward. This is an example of some of the work that we do, and the work that we do is mainly generated by ideas from our membership. So they tell us what they're most concerned about, and then we do a prioritization exercise and we vote as a membership, and that goes to the executive committee and they sign off on it when it fits also the strategic plan. As you can see, we have focused on 6 areas. And these bleed into each other a little bit, obviously, but a lot of work on quality and quality by design by creating better protocols so that we can have actionable, reliable data at the end of it. Patient engagement, how to engage with patients to design better trials, how the investigator and site community can be strengthened through qualification and training and avoiding training inefficiencies. Digital health trials will be a lot of what I talk about today. But there we've talked about novel endpoints, digital health technologies, decentralized trials, which I'll talk about later. But then also, as you do that, what does that really mean for sites and patients? And what do we need to keep in mind when we set up trials like that? It could have fit into novel clinical trial designs, but we split it up. So there we have recommendations around master protocol studies, using real world data to plan recruitment and enhance eligibility criteria, embedding trials onto registries. And then we've done a lot of work on antibacterial, pediatric and HAVAP studies. And lastly, but not least, we have been working for about 10 years on the use of a single IRB and how that could work in making trials more efficient, how to organize data monitoring committees to ensure that patients are kept safe while they participate in clinical trials, performing a higher quality informed consent process, and IND safety reporting. So you see our work really runs the gamut. But as we were thinking at the executive committee about, what to approve next and how to move forward, there really was a thought that we should include I thought there was going to be a different slide here. I'll talk a little bit later maybe about our vision for clinical trials 2030, because we kind of created a vision that really has 5 areas. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the previous slide if I can. 5 areas, which is trials by 2030, clinical trials should be patient-centered and easily accessible. They should be fully integrated into health processes. They should be designed with a quality approach. They should maximally leverage all available data, and they should improve population health. And clinical trials need to be a critical part of the evidence generating system. And as we think about that, a lot of decentralized trials feed into that. And the goal of setting that vision for 2030 was that then we could do projects that really deal with getting us to that goal. We've been lucky enough that the work that we have done already creates a foundation for that goal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Decentralized Clinical Trials. And I linked here where you can find all our resources. Being a public-private partnership and getting a grant from the Food and Drug Administration, we take very seriously that we put all our resources online and there for everybody to see and for everyone to download. And the decentralized clinical trial work that we launched in 2018 is now one of the most downloaded documents and visited pages on our website. As I mentioned, it sort of fits into a whole digital health trial solutions hub. In 2015, as I said, the members bring projects to us. In 2015, one of the other ways we get projects is Food and Drug Administration can ask us to work on something. So in 2015, they asked us to work on decentralized trials, on digital health trials, and using technology to improve clinical trials. And we split that up at the time in 4 different projects. Like, first of all, how can you think about developing a novel endpoint? Because now that you use technology, you might not need to use the endpoints that we have that maybe don't serve us all that well. Maybe it is about digitizing a 6-minute walk test, but maybe it is about sleep in certain diseases. And then once you have a novel endpoint that matters to the patients living with the disease, you should select a digital health technology to match that endpoint. And once you then start being able to gather information remotely, you can start thinking about decentralizing a trial. And maybe participants don't always have to come in to get the outcome assessed, but it can be assessed in different ways. And as you do that, as I mentioned, it's really also about making sure that you take the participants and the sites sort of view and all that in mind, because the roles change vastly as you look at it that way. Decentralized clinical trials were not new when we started on them. Here you see a slide from Craig Lipset, who's sort of an evangelist, I would say, for decentralized clinical trials, outlining what all had happened before 2018. It actually goes to 2020. And so now it would be the 18-year-old history of decentralized trials. So these are not true, new, but they sort of were based on the back of technology that helped us to collect things in a different way. And like I said, when we started this project, it was in 2015. Even since then, a lot of things have happened, but we had some experiences that we could work on. And that is really how City works, is really talking to people that have done this already, whereas others might have thought that this was hard to do. And how can we learn from those positive deviants to create recommendations that everybody could benefit from? So when we look at our recommendations and the definitions we've used, the scope of our recommendations are after consent. So we did not necessarily look at consenting technologies and things like that, but really at the time of trial execution. And we define clinical trials as those that were executed through telemedicine and mobile healthcare providers, using procedures that are different from the traditional clinical trial model. For example, instead of handing out your investigational medical product, drugs or whatever it is, to the participant as they visit the sites, you would ship them directly to the trial participant. And as you can imagine, this has an amazing amount of benefits for participants and potentially for trial organizer, trial sponsors as well. You could imagine a faster trial recruitment, because I think there's been statistics out there that more than 70% of potential trial participants live more than 2 hours away from the clinical site. So you can imagine that not everybody therefore can participate in the older model, and that this newer model is really helpful. The retention might be easier because people don't have to figure out a babysitter if they have to come to a site. That then leads into greater control and convenience, as well as comfort for the participants, and hopefully also an increased participant diversity, because again, you're not reliant on only the people that live close to you, and diversity can be in rural or urban or you know, ethnic and minority participation as well. To keep in mind before we go into the recommendations is that doing a decentralized clinical trial does not have to be an all or nothing activity. So what we wanted to highlight is that you can just think about doing certain activities remotely using these mobile or healthcare providers. For example, maybe if patients don't have to come into the sites for every single blood draw, vital signs could be measured in a different way, or trial drug injections could be done by home health nurses, for example. You may still need to do some visits in a traditional way, if, for example, for certain eligibility criteria, maybe talk about trial progress or review any participants' questions they may have. Again, remember, these were all done before 2018. This was launched in 2018. And you may still need visits to a facility or your research facility when you require major medical equipment to do your procedures, x-rays, MRI, CT. I think we've now also seen that those could be done closer to home, so they might not have to come into USC, but they could maybe go to a local imaging center to do that. And what you also might think of in one single trial is to sort of enroll some patients in a traditional way while you manage others decentralized or remote. Another couple of things we need to keep in mind is that technology has limitations. And there definitely is a disparity in access. I think we've all heard about that when education went remote in the midst of a pandemic. So that is still a consideration you need to have here, and make sure that in whatever setting you're trying to do your trial, that it kind of works for any access issues. There is at some point, a virtual visit cannot completely replace an in-person visit or human connection. And obviously not all endpoints can be measured remotely. So there are some limitations that you just need to think through for whichever trial you're thinking about. The way we set up our recommendations was in 6 sections. As you see here, one was around approaches and protocol design. The other one is around telemedicine state licensing laws. The original title of this project was actually regulatory and legal barriers to decentralized trials, but we kind of made it more broadly, but that's where that state licensing issue came in. How to use mobile healthcare providers, how to think about the drug supply chain. This is that investigational medical product management I talked about earlier. How to do investigator delegation and oversight. There was a lot of questions about that. And how do you monitor safety in a decentralized trial where maybe participants don't come in as much and you feel like, there's different ways that that might need to be done. So I'll delve into a little bit of each of these sessions. So for the first one is engagement of stakeholders is really key when you start designing these kind of trials. And that can include patients, regulators, IRBs, investigators, CRO, pharmacies. The players in a decentralized clinical trial, there's usually more players in this type of a trial, and you really need to involve them from the beginning when you start designing your protocol. Meeting with regulatory involvement is also quite important, especially early on in the process. And we were able to describe examples of specific meeting types that you could ask for, and the specific FDA offices that you might need to talk to. In the meantime, there's a digital center of excellence that was created. That's not in our recommendations, but that might be another office you may want to think about. We've also said that it's really good to maybe work with experienced vendors the first time around. People that have experience in executing decentralized clinical trials, and also people that have experience with telemedicine and mobile provider experience. There's some specialties in which telemedicine is a little bit more used anyway in clinical care, so that might also be a good spot to sort of think about doing a clinical trial first. And then in your protocol design, as you go decentralized, you can imagine that it really behooves you to focus on what matters, to really think about what matters to the safety of trial participants and also the credibility of the results. Next is the telemedicine state licensing section. So as you do clinical trials across numerous states, our recommendations was, and it feels a little antiquated now, but our recommendation was to maintain an investigator in each active trial state. And that has to do with medical licensing and also INP. Or what you could do is use less investigators, but make sure they have the licenses in all the states that you might want to work with. And again, you could also contract with vendors that provide mobile services across states. Healthcare providers, local healthcare providers is a local regulation. So you kind of need to think about that a little bit differently too. It is a very complex and sort of a varying state by state legal landscape. So there are some online policy resources we list that you can use, but we also recommend to dedicate internal legal staff or seek legal consultants that can help you navigate this. Again, this has changed a little bit in terms of COVID, but we'll talk about that in a second. Using mobile healthcare providers is it's really good to work with some that have had experience conducting clinical trial activities, because it is a little bit different than conducting regular care. So you might need specific credentials, experience, and training to sort of consider when you select those people. It's also possible that if you think about what they can do, they contribute to a lot of things. They could do the blood draws for you, biological sample, administer IMP, help with training for the participant. If maybe there's a questionnaire people need to fill out online, or if they have to self-administer their drugs, how they can help with clinical assessment, and they can also do compliance check. They can sort of be your eyes and ears a little bit on site and making sure that your participants complete their diaries on time and that they store the drug, for example, correctly if it has to be stored in a refrigerator. The drug supply chain is another legal landscape kind of a thing where you need to make sure that the state laws are taken into account. What you also need to do when you start decentralizing your trial and you're sending a direct-to-patient shipment is really identify and describe clearly to investigators, IRBs, and regulatory agencies how you're going to do this. Really outline the steps and create SOPs for that as well. And also maybe think if a vendor could help you doing this. If they've already done it, they might be able to help you, and then you can learn from those vendors for the next time around. Delegation and oversight, everybody's always worried about who belongs on the 1572. If you do drug trials and device trials, maybe they're not as easily decentralized anyway, but that's a different story. So this is highly protocol specific. And really the thing you need to think about is what is routine care versus practice of medicine, and practice of medicine versus clinical trial related activity. If people are doing routine care, they probably do not need to be on a 1572. If they're doing something specific, very critical and specific to the clinical trial, that might need to go on the 1572. And that's how you need to think that's how you consider what should go on the 1572 and who's responsible for what, and the PI would have to delegate that. Safety monitoring is, again, a highly specific issue to the protocol. But the one thing you probably do need to do, and we have some examples of that in case studies, is clearly articulate procedures and train the investigative staff on how you're going to do that, which is probably unique to a decentralized trial. And you also need to make sure that trial participants know how this is going to work. Like if they have an AE, where can they go to? Pre-coordinate with those facilities in advance as an investigator as to what documentation needs to be had and things like that, and develop protocol specific safety monitoring and communication escalation plans. When does an AE become something bigger than an AE, and when do you need to sort of take action that then results in protocol changes and things like that? And this gets really complex because there's a lot of data that comes in and sort of expectations of when maybe digital markers come in on an ongoing basis, like when they might be looked at, what will be identified as an AE and things like that. It gets to be really complex, but you just need to think about it in advance and kind of line out how you're going to approach it. So we developed our recommendations and launched them in December of 2018. And we were plugging along. 2019, a lot of excitement for decentralized clinical trials. As I mentioned, our recommendations were downloaded often, and then COVID happened. And so this is where before people might have thought it was risky to do a decentralized clinical trials. With COVID and lockdown, it shifted. And there was this sense that maybe it was risky not to do a decentralized clinical trial, because if you could switch your trial to a decentralized trial, you could maybe salvage it, where otherwise, Eric mentioned it earlier, many trials were stopped, many were halted and things like that. So there was definitely a shift. To show you a little bit what that shift looked like, this is from a report from Oracle that's available online and was gathered in November. They asked what the biggest impact was on ongoing trials for COVID, and it was longer timelines. I think that had to do with stopping and sites being at home, being coordinators being at home, research center staff being sent home, protocols needed to be amended, and they were often paused. There were some other impacts that you see here, but it really was really an accelerated evolution of clinical trials sort of in this environment. How did it impact your strategy for running trials? So all of a sudden, about half of the people surveyed said they were implementing or planning on implementing decentralized trial. As we mentioned earlier, there's new ways that we need to look at clinical supply, logistics, and vendors. And some were considering different geographies for their trial location. Especially in the beginning, the virus hopped around a little bit. Was probably not the right way of saying it, but it kind of went all over the place a little. And there were areas where there was a lot of viral load and a lot of infections, and areas with less. And I think we're now all sort of in a similar high viral environment. But at the time, sort of switching in geographies was an option. And as you can tell, over 3/4 of people said that it accelerated the adoption of decentralized clinical trial methods. What steps had they taken to accelerate the adoption was really more adopting patient-facing technologies or alternatives, redesigning the protocol. Again, protocols that were designed before COVID had to be changed to be able to be continued during COVID. And also investigator-facing technologies or alternatives, and then a rewrite of the SOPs. New workforce skills were needed and processes. As I mentioned, people were at home. both as a participant and as a site research staff, and new partnerships had to be forged. We did a webinar in the beginning of the pandemic in March or April, where we tried to be helpful to the research community as they were grappling with this in the middle of it. And Laura Cook kind of at the time had this slide showing that pre-COVID, the research was site-based visits and care. And then with COVID, we really had to switch that, and the industry, she was an industry perspective from Amgen, really had to sort of rethink how to organize their trial, and it really became a new normal for clinical trial visits. To inform that webinar, we did a survey, an informal survey of our members and more. We ballooned it everywhere, and many people responded to us. We had about 62 respondents that kind of spanned, again, the variety of perspectives in the clinical trial enterprise. And what we learned is that there were certain parts of site visits, that pre-pandemic regular site visits, that really were transitioned to remote and virtual. There's sort of around two different axes. One is the site participant interaction, so the site staff interacting with participants. So there was a re-envisioned way of doing consent through e-consenting. Study visits were supplemented or supplanted by mobile healthcare provider visits, so the patients did not have to come into the site, the research site facility. And that mainly happened for safety collection. That was something that really wanted to be maintained, is making sure that participants were kept safe. So that was a lot of blood draws and local labs. And then on some instances that also worked for endpoint collection in case of wearable sensors, clinical reported outcomes, PROs, and online cognitive tests. And the other thing that had really shifted and changed was sort of the shipment of investigational product, instead of participants coming to sites and picking it up and doing the whole drug accountability as part of a site visits. The other side had also changed. So sponsor, CRO, and site interactions were also different because of travel restrictions. Monitors couldn't go to the sites. If they went to the site, there wasn't anyone there at the site. The research coordinators were also home. So this whole switch of site initiation visits and doing them remotely is definitely what happened. And then also monitoring, ongoing monitoring systems were set up where both the monitor and the research coordinator was sort of at home, but there was a way to do everything online, or to do a lot of things online, and actually more than they thought they could do. What were some of the hurdles was really, and switching, is the simplification of the protocol midstream was really not that easy. What assessments to keep? What are the statistics implications of changing your endpoints and things like that? That was something that was not easy. What platform to choose? I mean, many platforms could be chosen. You could do Zoom visits, you could do WebEx, you could do Google Meets, but you could also do a regular phone call or Skype. So there were many options, and every choice came with different licenses and contracts, and there was no best standards. Ease of use and adoption, was it something to consider? And that was different for different participants within a trial at different sites. And some of those things are just, if you've never used it as a participant, it's just not that easy. And there really was limited access to telehealth platforms pre-pandemic. And the reimbursement for remote and virtual visit was something that had to be changed midstream, because is it cheaper to do it when it's remote? Is it harder because everybody's having to do different things? How do you reimburse that? Those were all hurdles that needed to be dealt with. All of a sudden, supplementing and finding people that could draw local labs for you, that could be local healthcare providers, wasn't all that easy either, because the local part of the healthcare providers is governed by local laws and regulations. Licensing and contracts were also difficult. It's not always known how good the quality is going to be of those people that you've never worked with in the past that are doing it locally. And in many cases, they were sort of competing, for lack of a better word, with home healthcare providers that were doing clinical care at the homes of patients, having nothing to do with a clinical trial, but just regular care and maybe sick COVID patients. So there was a little bit of sort of capacity issue. And obviously, you cannot do every assessment that way either. figuring out how to get investigational medical product to sites, how to get it to participants. What if you have to administer IV? How do you do that? Those were hurdles. And these monitoring visits, like what and how do you do that? Sites were short-staffed. They were working from home. They had kids at home. How do you schedule that? This was maybe not their priority either. And how do you really go to risk-based monitor where you just monitor the things that matter? So at the end of our webinar, at the time, these were sort of the words of wisdoms and best practices that we told people to do, is to really, as a site, think ahead and create a plan of how you keep your trials going once you've heard from the sponsor that, that they were going to continue. Test run the telehealth platforms, be flexible, and maintain clear and ongoing communication. This communication piece is something that was very clear at the time. A lot of participants in ongoing trials heard like crickets. They heard nothing from the organizers, from the sponsors. And that really was something that was a best practice, that really you need to stay in communication with your participants and also with your sponsor. Evaluate on the go which assessments can be done remotely. How do you use these mobile healthcare programs in local lab and match them to the assignment you need? Follow the regulations, and there's a lot of them. There's privacy, OCR, local ethics, and IRB. And be respectful of sites, because this is not their only priority. They're also sort of running ragged a little bit. And figure out, run a statistics analysis to determine whether your remote data is even going to be valid and helpful to you. If you're a technology organization that provides these platforms, make sure that they're privacy compliant. Make sure there's training for patients and caregivers and sites on the platform. Make sure there's an appropriate environment when these visits are done. Maybe Alexa should be turned off if you're having a remote visit, and know how to handle failure so that when the computer breaks down or something happens, that you have a backup plan. We then also asked our members, and really, because we are now moving into what are the lessons learned now that we're a little bit into it, and we collected our information. So now we're March, April to September, October. So about 6 months ahead, we kind of went like, okay, we've been doing this for a while. What are you finding now? And again, we have a variety of respondents from different areas that responded. And a lot of the survey findings really see this switch and decentralized trials. The switch to e-consent was actually found that the compliance might be better because it is recorded. There were some comments about we need to be sure of the simplification. Now that, in March, I think some people thought that by the fall, this would be, it would be over a little bit, but now they've started pre-planning for new trials as they come on board. And it's been found that that is helpful. Virtual and remote visits, we've now shown that we kind of have gotten comfortable with doing that sort of telemedicine trials. The right incentives were put in place. I think the FDA did a lot of good things, and sort of the licensing issues were taken care of. And we really found that it facilitated research and there was more widespread participation. The beauty of working with local labs and healthcare providers was that participants could stay locally. Some labs and imaging centers were set up easier than others. And it kind of becomes a logical extension now of where we're going. Investigational medical products, like not everything was appropriate for shipping and self-administration. And there were some geographic differences that drove site receptiveness to shipping directly to the patient. For monitoring, this is more the sponsor site interaction. There was sort of an increased appreciation of what could be done off-site, but setting it all up proactively really was felt that that would be helpful. So all of this is leading us to a new refresh of our recommendations that I talked to you about. Like I said, they came out in 2018. The world feels very different with regards to decentralized clinical trials. And we've given ourselves a timeline of a year to update sections on the protocol design and decentralized approaches and the drug supply chain. And we're really wanting to use our lessons learned to sort of just update the things that need to be updated because we've actually have a lot more experience. So in conclusion of that is that we felt there was a real momentum towards digital health trials and decentralized trials. And from our members, we really heard 60% of them saying that that the changes will be continued to be implemented in trials going forward. So I think we will not see decentralized clinical trials slink back to where they were. I think there's going to be real change in how we do things in the future. And about 60% of them that are implementing those changes also are putting some evaluation system in place to make sure that the changes they are implementing are not degrading the clinical trial process. I'm sure that when people talk about decentralized clinical trials, it seems like something that industry is mainly adopting. But I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about an academic example that I think will be inspirational. And I'm sure there's more, but this one I'm a little closer to, so I would like to talk about a little bit. So this is a smaller trial that happened, and the results were published in November, where fluvoxamine was tested against placebo for clinical deterioration in outpatients with symptomatic COVID-19. So the trial was randomized, and it was found that fluvoxamine might decrease clinical deterioration. This was presented at the COVID Accelerator Forum that the Reagan-Udall Foundation, I'm sure other forums as well, was presented there. And everybody was like, well, this is a really nice result, but it has to be confirmed with a bigger trial. And by the way, you better do this quickly because the pandemic is ongoing now and we kind of need to know now. So this was sort of the charge that Eric Lenz at Washington University in St. Louis got. And he designed the Stop COVID-2 trial. So this is now a larger trial with 1,100 patients and an enriched samples where participants are randomized between fluvoxamine, 100 milligram twice a day for 15 days versus placebo. And the outcomes are clinical deterioration over 15 days with a definition of shortness of breath and or hospitalization and pulse oximetry under 92%. And then secondary outcomes of 15-day and 3-month function using a global health scale. This trial is decentralized and has many decentralized elements at the moment. One side is active, and that side is that's Washington University, and they're randomizing about 10 patients a day. That is vastly different, I would think, than most academic trials. They're doing a national recruitment. So if you know anyone who's recently diagnosed with COVID-19, I think it's within 6 days. It's a randomized trial. It's run completely remotely. The recruitment is online. You sign up online. Once you qualify, you get randomized. Study supply shipment is shipped to you, and the medication is shipped to you as well with FedEx. And then they do telemedicine intervention and remote monitoring to get at the endpoints. What that has meant is the trial started on the 23rd of December. So that's a good month and 10 days. Yeah, a good month and 10 days. And they've enrolled 20 patients so far, 200 patients out of the 1,100. There's only one site activated, but there's partner sites coming up in Seattle, Utah, Northwestern, and McGill. And so this, I think, is an example that shows this can really be done. And we've had conversation with Eric about how to do the decentralization, mainly how to do the drug shipment. And he ended up going with an experienced vendor that had done this before. So I think what I wanted to show with this is that this should not be limited to industry sites, industry trials, but as an academic community, we can think about how to do our trials this way too. And I think this shows that it's possible. I'm sure there's many other options, but I just wanted to highlight this one. And then that brings me to my last slide. I don't know how many of you are Pink Floyd fans, but this made me think of the Wall when we were talking about the title. So breaking brick walls, and I guess it really is time to sort of think of the world as a different place, and switching to decentralized clinical trials and sort of making trials more patient-centric, allowing more comfortable situations for participants, allowing more participation, and expanding our their reach and their ability to enroll in trials that they are interested in is really critical. And I think this might be able to make trials a little bit more efficient so that we can maybe do more trials and answer more questions that we have on many diseases that really deserve answers. So with that, I think this is my last slide. I think on the last slide, there is, yep. So you can sign up for our newsletters, and you can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, because we also post a lot about what we're doing, and I hope this was of interest to you. So thanks again. I know, oh, I told you I was going to go a little quicker, so I guess I went a little quicker than expected, but hopefully we have a few questions that we can answer.
We do, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Tenaerts. This was excellent, exactly what we were hoping for, and exactly what I think a lot of us needed to hear. So I've got a few questions for you, and so if other people have questions.
I'm no longer sharing my screen, right? So
right, correct.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So if people have questions that come up while Dr. Tenaerts is answering some of these, please type them into the Q&A or the chat. I can field both of them. Okay, so first question we have, does CTTI have decentralized certification for stakeholders? It would be helpful to readily find the stakeholders, such as vendors, investigators, providers, etc., that are familiar with these guidelines and have undergone sufficient training to execute in the new landscape.
That's a good question. We do not. So we have created recommendations. We really talk more about concepts and principles and process improvement rather than saying you should work with this person or that person, because it really is a fit for purpose situation. And somebody might have experience in one disease and that could help in another disease, but it might also not help. It just sort of depends. And we're really not and as a public-private partnership, it's also hard for us to say, this group is good and that one might not be good, because we're supported by the FDA, and it kind of just makes for a difficult conversation that way. So we are really not in a position to do that. We are launching a use case library for CTTI that will be online in the next couple of months, where we show how people have used our recommendations, not specific to decentralized trials, but that will come in there as well, but how they've used our recommendations. And we hope that that will help people to think about how they might use our recommendations. That's more how we think about how to change the environment. If you have questions about anything specific, so all this work is on the shoulders of a huge community. We've had hundreds of people helping us with digital health trials, about 50 people helping us with decentralized trials. So if people have questions, there's often an opportunity for us to put you in contact with people that have been on the projects. Those people are also listed on our website. If you go to anything under what we do, all the projects are listed. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, all the names of whoever participated on our projects is listed. So that might be another place to go to ask for information. But that's the closest we can do we try to broker conversation and really have people talk to people that have experience, but a certification is really not sort of what we're doing.
Great, thank you. Another question is, has the partnership focused on the area of identifying strategies to support the implementation of decentralized trials?
Say that, can you say that again? Sorry.
Sure. Has the partnership focused on the area of identifying strategies to support the implementation of decentralized trials?
So I think our recommendations are exactly that. I mean, I gave you a high level sort of items that were in our recommendations. Our recommendations are a little more specific like that, that can give you some strategies as to how to then actually implement them. And again, if there's questions after that, we can talk to you and help you out by making the right connections. Yeah.
Okay, so here's an example. Here's a question with an example. So what advice do you have for dealing with the funders of projects, especially for those that began offline and move online? So, funders were promised one thing and now something new is being conducted. So one webinar attendee asks, I'm running a CTSI funded pilot of a psychosocial intervention in an infectious disease clinic. We started pre-COVID and we've switched to all treatment and assessments being done virtually. Unfortunately, the clinic that was supported through 5 previous versions of the grant has shown an almost antagonistic attitude towards our work. They seem to feel that this type of intervention is not their mission, and they have made recruitment and retention methods difficult. What suggestions do you have here?
That is a difficult situation. I think it's having conversations, I imagine. I mean, that's how our work works a little bit. We have a mission to sort of change people's ideas of how to do things better. And we find that through conversations and open discussions, we sometimes can get to yes on things where before people weren't really seeing that. But sometimes there are people that just have different opinions. So that is a really difficult situation. And I appreciate that. And it's the clinic that they're working with. That's complicated.
Yeah. And I wonder too if, I mean, a question I had too was just, what do you think the future looks like for decentralized trials? And I wonder if that's something that over time, as people are realizing that we can't just delay things forever. And I don't think we need to prepare for the next pandemic, but, recognizing kind of all the benefits that some of these other trials are seeing, maybe helping bring in some research or showing, some examples of other trials that, look, this is really going well. And this is, something that we can enhance the current intervention that we have.
Right. And I think one of the things I'd like to highlight is our recommendations were set up with the idea that you would start off thinking you were going to do a decentralized trial. And how would you set that up? That was slightly different than what had to happen in March and April, where like the previous question, the person asking the previous question, you start off thinking you're going to do one thing, then all of a sudden you cannot do that trial anymore for a variety of reasons. Participants were not comfortable coming into sites for risk of exposure. Your coordinators were sent home by the hospital system, all those things that happened. And that is a different environment. Going forward, that is the recommendations we're trying to change, is sort of this, and we're not using this, but I keep thinking about if you pandemic proof a trial, your trial would probably be easier to conduct in general, to sort of think of those things in advance. And some of those things have nothing to do with decentralization, but sort of the regular quality by design work that we did, that do you really need, 7 primary endpoints and 14 secondary endpoints? In some cases you do, but in many cases you don't. And how can you make your trials more feasible right off the bat? And sort of just thinking about streamlining and fit for purpose. And I hope that these, that the methodology of a decentralized clinical trial will continue, because there's many benefits, but there is a little bit of analysis that needs to be done to be sure that there's no unintended consequences of something that we didn't anticipate and is actually going in the wrong direction, rather than in sort of a positive direction, either for patient safety or for reliability of the data that you collect.
Great, thank you. A couple more. So based on your work and the atmosphere of your work, is there similar responsiveness, resources, and consultations of Citi for COVID-19 specific studies versus studies that have nothing to do with COVID? So this person says, I think it's very obvious that COVID-19 studies have to be decentralized, but it feels like there are barriers when COVID is not the central topic of the trial.
So we, when the pandemic started, I hinted that we did some special webinars on how to deal with ongoing trials when the pandemic hit. We did a webinar on how to increase diversity of trial participants, since it became so clear that people may be most affected by the pandemic were not always typically enrolled in clinical trials. Other webinars that we did were COVID-oriented webinars. Things like, what is a good COVID trial? That had nothing to do with decentralization, but it's still a good question, because we do a lot of work in downloading clinicaltrials.gov every day and sort of doing analysis on clinicaltrials.gov. We created a daily download of COVID trials, COVID-19 trials. So it wasn't specific to treatment. It was everything: treatment, vaccine, anything you could think of. And we saw this explosion of trials, maybe not all of which were what you would call trials that will lead us to actionable data. And I think Janet Woodcock talked about that they did an analysis at FDA that only 5% of ongoing COVID treatment trials will lead to actionable results. So that has nothing to do with decentralization, but the example I gave you is that there are ways to do a COVID-19 trial, maybe especially in the outpatient setting, where you can think about decentralization. And I think the Stop COVID trial is a good example of that, especially if you can work with a repurposed drug or something like that, sort of something that's already known and it's not like a complete novel drug might not be the best way right now to do in a decentralized fashion, but there is definitely a way to do a decentralized COVID treatment trial. That was the example I just showed. Yeah.
Thanks. What are your thoughts around how to handle differences in treatment delivery, for example, non-drug, for centralized versus decentralized participants in a given study? This could impact the outcomes through differential treatment effects.
So is the question about some participants picking it up at the site and others having the product delivered?
I believe so. So I mean, if I interpret this the right way, so say you're giving an intervention that could be delivered in person. Let's say it's a psychotherapy trial. You could deliver it in person, or you could do it online. So now you have differences in the people that have.
That is actually a very cool situation, because you could almost randomize to that or see if there are differences when you do that trial. And that could almost become sort of a validation study for the online version. You could sort of see if it was the same effect or not. So in some ways that could be very cool. Might be unintended, but that could be. We always hope that clinical trial methodologies will be randomized as well to sort of see whether one methodology works better than another or is equal than another. So having that in a maybe organized way could be a very cool way to identify whether it works or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a natural way almost, for some of these studies that we're recruiting and seeing people in person that just completely switched online. I mean, we don't know, right. I'm a clinical psychologist, so, I think more about these non-drug trials, but it's just so interesting to be able to see, like, does this telehealth experiment work? Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that's what I mentioned in the beginning when it was not an all or nothing thing. So you could either have it unintentionally because you were doing it in person and now you can no longer do it in person. And that's a little harder to analyze on the back end, I guess, because there's confounding issues. But if you could do it randomized, that would actually be beautiful, right? Because then you could maybe see the difference. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if this question is very general, and I think you covered a lot of this, but I'll read it anyway. Can a study that is currently not decentralized become such?
So that is what happened when we did that webinar in March. That was all talking about studies that were never meant to be decentralized, how to decentralize those. And I think one of the activities people mostly did at the time was sort of identifying this is not the right word, but the criticalness of the study. So if it's maybe an oncology study, that is a study that you might want to absolutely keep going and really focus on how to make that happen. If there's like if there's, I keep saying like for warts or something that doesn't feel as critical, maybe in a pandemic, like a wart treatment, but maybe, yeah, so that is exactly what happened. A lot of the trials did become decentralized, like on the flip of a dime, because they had to. A lot of trials were stopped, and I think a lot of trials were paused, and as they were paused, that was the moment people were trying to figure out if they could decentralize them or not. So that's exactly what happened. Now, what that is going to mean in the end is going to be a very interesting activity too, right? Because there's going to be like, well, we could do it and it worked. And then there's going to be these statistical analysis at the end, like, did you actually get the data that you thought you were going to get after you switched? Sort of what you were talking about, like you started one way in person and then it was remote. And then it might be that you may just not have had like trial participants dropped off because of a variety of reasons and things like that. And there might be sort of an element of sort of trials that are like a lost generation of trials, sort of a little bit like trials that while the idea of doing it is the right one, it wasn't the right situation in which to do it. And there might just be unintended consequences of that, but that might have nothing to do with the methodology. That might be the right thing to do if you pre-plan it.
Great, thanks. If you don't mind, one more question before we break. I was just thinking about in terms of the front end. Let's say you're planning for this decentralized trial, or even once you've switched over. the budget implications of some of this. So let's say you have, this equipment and you want 100 people to come in and use the equipment that you have. They're all going to use the same device. Now, do you need to go out and buy 100 pieces of this equipment so you can ship it to the person so they can use it at home? So what's been your experience, or just what have you heard in terms of, a funder that just says like, this is nuts? You might be able to reach, a lot more people, but, this just has pretty massive budget implications.
I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure we focused on that particular question, but the question we did focus on in our engaging sites and patients, so more in the pre-planning, that these trials feel different, right? So you may have to, like you said, give devices to people, and that's more expensive than maybe, if you have to give everyone an an EKG monitor that measures you personally versus coming in and doing an EKG, that's a different financial situation. The other things, the budgets do change, because when we ask patients, for example, who would you like to call when your device doesn't work that is collecting the data? They were not interested in calling like 1-800-Apple or I would say like a technology company. Like they weren't interested in calling that. They wanted to call the site. So the training is different. So yes, you may not have the coordinator see the patients, but the training of that coordinator and what that coordinator still needs to be there, because now they need to do other things. So I think the budgets look very different. They were worried about the budgets in March, April, when we did that first webinar. It feels like that settled out on the back end, but those are industry sponsors who were like managing their own budgets, right? We must be a little bit different than an academic sponsor who has other people that are sponsoring them and making the case. Yeah. But again, it's sort of like, do you lose the trial in some ways? Like that's the situation the funder is also sort of stuck with. Like, do you lose the trial, or do we try to make it make it continue by maybe adding a little bit more money and maybe learning about a new technology and at the same time?
That's great. I've been thinking about just, writing up journal articles. Like I hope journals will give you a little bit more space to just say, how COVID has impacted this, because, every study has been impacted by this and everyone's going to have to write up something about it. So.
And that was one thing that we definitely heard from the FDA, and probably is something good to consider when you think about NIH funded studies. Every change you make, document with a COVID tag, so that down the line you can remember what you did, because you will think you will never forget this, and you will. So we highlighted to document with very specific COVID tags that you can find afterwards again, so you can figure out what you did and what that may have caused in the
great idea.
Yeah,
that's great. Okay, well, we want to thank you so much. I just want to mention real quick in the chat, you'll see that Karen, our coordinator, has put in a link, so you can please take a very brief survey if you can. And also the slides will be made available, and Karen everybody who's here today is going to get an email with a link to the slides and the actual talk itself. So,
and I'll say too that on our website, there's other webinars and they're all available to view, and all the slide sets from those webinars are also downloadable. So there's plenty more.
Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Tenaerts. We really appreciate this. This was wonderful, and I hope everybody here on the call has a great day.